Lugupeetud daamid ja härrad, kolleegid, alustame ja teie loal ma teen ühe väikese sissejuhatuse, et paari sõnaga lihtsalt pean ma mainima seda, et selle teema algataja meie komisjonis, Riigieelarve kontrolli erikomisjonis, oli omal ajal härra Aaviksoo, kes praegu Riigikogus juba ei tööta, eks ju, aga tema initsiatiivil see tekkis ja küsimuse all oli riigieelarve läbipaistvus. Sellest kõik algas. Ja juba peale seda, kui härra Aaviksoo läks juhtima üht tähtsat asutust, jäi meil otsustada, kes meil selle teemaga hakkab komisjonis tegelema. Ja juhtus nii, et selle töö tahtis endale ja sai kolleeg Kristjan Kõljalg. Ja tänase päeva jooksul mul on sellise pulmakindrali töö, ma alustan ja lõpetan, aga kõik ülejäänud on Kristjanil, kes tegi väga suure töö viimase mõne kuuga juba ära ja praegu ta selgitab, millest me praegu räägime. Palun, Kristjan. Veel üks asi kindlasti, et kõik läheb linti ja ma palun, et kui läheb küsimusteks lahti, eks ju, kui te küsite, üldse võtate sõna, siis öelge palun oma nimi, et protokolli saaks kõik õigesti kantud. Aitäh! Eesti kanal on 1 ja Inglise kanal on 2. Siin kuskil peaksid olema need aparaadid.
Nii, aitäh, Mihhail, ja tere hommikust. Et nii nagu Mihhail ütles, siis see tänane päev ja tänane konverents on ajendatud meie endise kolleegi poolt tõstatatud teemast ja ma püüan tegelikult enda ettekannet võib-olla natukene kokku suruda, et meie külaline Joachim Wehner saaks natukene pikemalt rääkida. Aga ma alustan sellest, et kus me tegelikult olime, kui me siis selle raporti koostamisega alustasime, et milline see parlamendi roll õigusaktides on, et tegelikult põhiseaduses siis mõned paragrahvid, kus ta nii-öelda see põhisisu alguse saab ja siis meil on riigieelarve baasseadus või riigieelarve seadus nii-öelda baasseadus ja siis iga-aastane riigieelarve. Ja võib-olla mõne sõnaga, et mida siis on öeldud riigieelarve kohta, et kommenteeritud väljaandes põhiseadusest, et riigieelarve vastuvõtmine on üks olulisemaid parlamendi suveräänsuse elemente ja ka seda, et riigieelarvet võib käsitleda riigi majandusplaanina eelolevaks aastaks, samuti parlamendi iga-aastase usaldusavaldusena valitsusele ja tema kavatsetavale poliitikale. Et tegelikult see roll nagu põhiseaduse mõttes on päris märkimisväärne. Ja siis me jõuame selle nii-öelda baasseaduse juurde, et tegelikult Riigikogu roll selles baasseaduses paljuski piirdubki siis iga-aastase riigieelarve menetlemise ja kinnitamisega. Loomulikult saadab Vabariigi Valitsus teadmiseks ka eelarvestrateegia, see jõuab siis rahanduskomisjoni ja kes sellega siis tavaliselt teadmiseks võtab. Et selline on nii-öelda see õiguslik raam, kus me alustasime selle raporti koostamist ja ma mõne sõnaga räägin sellest raportist ja siis sellest, kuhu me tänaseks oleme jõudnud. Et raport ise sai väga kohmaka pealkirja, et fiskaalpoliitika paradigma võimalikest muutustest Eesti parlamentaarses süsteemis. Aga siis eesmärk, mis siis komisjoni poolt sai kokku lepitud, oli selline, et raporti eesmärgiks on siis leida võimalused, kuidas parandada parlamendi kaasarääkimise õigust riigi fiskaalpoliitika kujundamisel. Et selline hüpotees siis oli see, et see kaasarääkimisvõimalus äkki on liiga väike ja võimalik, et me peaksime seda siis pakkuma vähemalt välja variante, kuidas seda on võimalik suurendada. ja lõpuks eks see on suuresti komisjoni siis kinnitamise küsimus, et millistele järeldustele me jõuame. Ja nüüd ma räägin siis sellisest ajalisest raamist ja tegevustest, et nii nagu komisjoni esimees juba rääkis, siis tegelikult 2015 kevadel see teema tõusetus. Sügiseks me jõudsime siis selleni, et peaks olema raport. Valiti siis tõesti mind raportööriks ja me otsustasime minna seda teed, et kuna see raportite koostamise selline kogemus Eesti Parlamendis on mitte just üleliia suur, vaid pigem on neid tehtud suhteliselt üksikuid, siis me otsustasime, meil oli päris selline lai otsustamisruum, et kuidas üldse seda teha ja me otsustasime päris palju intervjuusid kasutada, et me intervjueerime suurusjärgus 5% Riigikogust, et saada siis Riigikogu liikmete käest teada, et kuidas neile tundub, et kuidas see olukord selle riigieelarvega on ja kas need hüpoteesid ja teemad, mis me tõstatasime, et kas need vastavad tõele ja millised need võimalikud lahendused võiksid olla. Et intervjuudega me päris lõpuni ei ole jõudnud, tuleb ka nii-öelda majaväliseid intervjuusid ja lõpuks on siis raporti koostamine eeldatavalt siis sel kevadel komisjonis saame raporti ka kinnitada. Ja nüüd kiiresti mõne sõnaga ka intervjuudest parlamendi liikmetega. Et me siis niimoodi, siin on mõned teemad toodud, et millest me rääkisime või räägime, et kuidas siis Riigikogu liikmed täna näevad Riigikogu rolli riigieelarve kujundamisel ja kas nad näevad, et homme või tulevikus võiks olla kuidagi teistsugune. Oleme rääkinud ka vormistuslikust küljest ja sellega rahulolust, siis sellest, et kas mõningad IT-lahendused võiksid olla abiks Riigikogu liikmetele, näiteks siin võib tuua kohe siis selle riigieelarve infosüsteemi, et kas seal võiks olla näiteks Riigikogu liikme vaade, et võib-olla natukene seda informatsiooni rohkem oleks ka igal parlamendi liikmel käes siis. Ja oleme suuresti rääkinud ka sellest parlamendi rollist eelarve täitmise kontrollimisel, et kuivõrd oluliseks seda peetakse ja et kas selles võiks olla ka mingisugust muutust, et kuidas see kontrollimine käib täna. Et üldiselt võib öelda niimoodi nende intervjuude põhjal, et ma ei taha nendest tulemustest väga täna rääkida, aga ütleme, et selline üldine seisukoht on suhteliselt ühtne, et see tunnetus nagu parlamendi liikmetel, et mis puudutab neid küsimusi. Loomulikult on ka seal selliseid äärmusi, aga nende intervjuude pealt võib öelda, et selline ühtset arvamust annab täiesti välja sõeluda, et mis see ühtne seisukoht võiks olla. Nii et selline on see raport ja tõesti, et meie eesmärgiks on siis selle raportiga vaadata neid võimalusi, kuidas parlamendi roll võiks muutuda eelarve ja tegelikult ka eelarvestrateegia kujundamisel ja siis pakkuda võimalikke variante välja. Aga et mitte rohkem aega kinni hoida, siis mul on hea meel, et Joachim Wehner sõltumata teatud takistustest Londonis on siiski lõpuks siia jõudnud ja ma annan talle sõna üle, nii et palun Joachim.
Good morning. It's fantastic to be here. Very excited to be in Estonia. I was in Estonia 8 years ago with an OECD team, and we were here to look at the budget system of Estonia, and we wrote a report on it, which you can get on the website of the OECD. It's called Budgeting in Estonia. And during this visit, we spoke to the Ministry of Finance, line ministries, agencies, State Audit Office, the Parliament, and we got an overview of the budget system of Estonia, and also made a series of recommendations that were tied to even further improving some of the elements of the budget system. And it's a really nice opportunity to come back after several years and look at one very, very important aspect of budgeting, which we looked at then and which is still kind of exercising you at the moment. So I will focus mostly on issues that have to do with the format of the annual budget law. I'll make a few remarks as well about how the budget law or the process of approving the annual budget relates to pre-budget reports or medium-term budget strategies, and give you a couple of examples how that works in other parliaments elsewhere. But I'm happy to take the discussion afterwards anywhere where you would like to take it. We can talk about other aspects of the parliamentary process as well, if you wish. Let me just see if I can make the... I'll just do that. So let me start off by making a point which Christian made at the start of his presentation, that this is a really, really fundamental topic. So this is a British politician called William Gladstone, who was Prime Minister 4 times in the 19th century, and who was Chancellor of the Exchequer 4 times. And this is more than any other British politician. And he is the architect of the British Treasury system. So he made a series of very important reforms in the 1860s in particular that are still guiding the fundamentals of how the British Treasury system operates, and by implication, the treasury systems of a few dozen countries around the world. And he said, if the House of Commons, by any possibility, lose the power of the control over the grants of public money, depend upon it, your very liberty will be worth very little in comparison. So he was really saying, if Parliament loses its authority over voting public money, the country will be in grave danger. And this goes back, if you look, I don't want to give a history lecture or anything like that, but the big historical events we've had in the histories of many countries, they often have to do with the struggle. Parliament wanting to get the right to assent to taxes and to approve expenditures. In Britain, the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the French Revolution, War of Independence in the United States, they all had to do with this question to a larger or smaller extent. But this is a very fundamental question. So the role of Parliament in approving taxation and expenditure is a fundamental original function of parliaments, the first function in many ways. And first came the power to approve taxation, and later on parliaments developed ways of controlling public expenditure. So taxes came first, but over the centuries, if you go back internationally, parliaments devised ways of controlling public spending as well. So if you look today across the world, you see this is a fundamental function of all democratic parliaments. So in recent decades, many OECD countries have moved to reforms in their public sector, which have to do with new public management and putting the public sector on a more performance-oriented basis. And this affects very much the nature of parliamentary control, and I want to focus a little bit in my discussion on this particular aspect. And this is reflected also in the format that Parliament uses to approve public spending. So the appropriation structure, the legal authorization of line items in the budget, reflects the degree to which a country has decided to focus its public sector on performance. And I will give you a few examples. So just by way of background, and this is kind of a very simple graph, and I'm sure some of you have come across it, especially if you work on performance audits, for example, in the State Audit Office or in the committee. But really the way money is used in government is it's used to purchase inputs, things that we use to produce a good or service. These are called outputs, so what we actually deliver, goods or services. And we hope that these things we do in government have an effect, an impact on society, outcomes. What goes on in this production chain is largely the control of the organization into which we put the money, but whether the outputs actually achieve the impacts that we want to achieve is also a function of other factors that are outside the control of individual agencies and government departments. Just keep that with you, and this is a basic kind of guide as I talk through the next few slides to show you how different parliaments approve public money. So my first example is from a very, very input-controlled system. This is from the United States Congress. And what you have here is one tiny extract of 30 pages of the transport appropriation in the United States Congress. So this is just for transportation. The entire Appropriation Act for transport consists of something like 30 pages, just one government department. And you can see it has a lot of very detailed financial information in it. It says how many dollars will go to specific office holders and offices within the Department for Transportation. This is a classic example of a very input-driven way of appropriating, authorizing public money. So the United States, if you go back to the graph I had earlier, is very much in the second category. It makes the link between money and inputs in terms of the congressional budget process. So the next example I will show you is from New Zealand, where here again, this is an example of the transport appropriation. So this is how the New Zealand Parliament appropriates money in the area of transport, and they do it on an output basis. So they go one step further in this chain that I showed you earlier, and you can see that the appropriations that are listed here resemble something that we might describe as programs. So you have, for example, let's say crash analysis, licensing activities, maritime port security. These tell you something about what the department is actually doing with the money it gets. It's producing crash analyses. It's carrying out licensing activities. It's undertaking activities that make ports more secure, etc. So this is a pure example of an output-based way of appropriating money by Parliament. The next example I'll show you goes even one step further, so just flipping back here. So we've done inputs, outputs, and I'll show you one example of an outcome-based appropriation system, which is how the Australian Parliament does it. So here's the transport appropriation from the Australian Parliament, and it's very short. It fits on half a page. So you compare this to the United States example I gave you earlier. There you had 30 pages with very detailed financial information. Here you are left with half a page, and this is the main control mechanism that Parliament has over public money in Australia. And the entire transport or infrastructure and regional development portfolio is essentially dealing with transport issues, amongst others. is voted on this half page, and it's broken down by outcomes. So the left-hand column will give you the intended impact on society. So it will say things like an efficient, sustainable, competitive, safe, and secure transport system, etc. So it will give you not the output, but even one step further, the intended impact or consequences on society of voting this money. Very radically different ways of authorizing the government to spend money. Very, very different. I'll give you, I think I have 2 more examples, and then I'll draw this together a bit and try to put it in a context that is relevant for your debate. Here's an appropriation structure that fits a little bit in between Australia and New Zealand. So it's a program-based appropriation. The example is from South Africa. It's, again, the transport sector. And it's 2 pages long. And the entire transport budget is approved on the program basis. So it will list, it will give you the total at the top, and then it breaks the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, for example, give you the different main programs in the transport budget. It will say a little bit what the program is all about. And then you can see that the columns provide further information that retain elements of an economic classification as well. So you not only have a program-based appropriation, but you also have additional kind of controls that relate to the economic purpose of the expenditure, whether it's for current purposes, capital, or whether it's a transfer or subsidy. So a little bit of additional information as well, but the main thing is that it's a program-based appropriation, and what binds the executive, the government, is the program. So the parliament votes by program, and that is binding on the government. And during the financial year, the government can move resources up to 8% of the amount that you can see for each program between the different programs. So you can take away money from one program and move it to another, but that is limited to an 8% margin. This, I think, is a very good in-between appropriation structure. This is how we do it in the United Kingdom, and I would not recommend it anywhere as a great example of parliamentary control. In fact, the United Kingdom Parliament has just launched an inquiry into the way it approves and authorizes public money. This is the entire transport appropriation for the United Kingdom from last year, 20 billion UK pounds, and this is the control that Parliament exercises over that money. It's not very much. Yeah, so essentially what happens in the United Kingdom is that more or less there's a little bit of a distinction between, there's some terms in here which are not so important, but there's a little bit of a distinction between current and capital, which is important. You know, there's nothing broken down here into programs. There's nothing that gives you a purpose of what are the priorities within the transportation budget of the United Kingdom. And as a result, the Department for Transport has a huge amount of discretion during the financial year to spend this money. And that's a large amount of money, 20 billion pounds, more than 25 billion euros. Okay, so I've shown you a few examples, 5 examples of the way that parliaments actually vote public money. And I think this is really important because you still in Estonia have a situation where the annual budget law is somewhat at odds with earlier budget documentation like the state budget strategy. State budget strategy has kind of supports a performance orientation in the budget, but the annual budget law still has this old format that is not congruent with the state budget strategy. So one of the big questions, and we raised it 8 years ago, is around how do you make the two speak to one another? So once you start asking questions around performance, you have to make some decisions that involve exactly this, the appropriation structure. What is the appropriate way of breaking down spending within the annual budget law? And since this is something that might be changing, I wanted to show you some real concrete examples. But I also want to extend that a little bit in the remaining time that I have. So what I showed you is in many countries just the legal authorization of public spending. But in most places, you have additional information that comes with that. So it has different names. Sometimes it's a memorandum. I think in Estonia, you have a memorandum that accompanies the annual budget from the government or the budget bill. In the UK, we call them estimates. In many more Anglophone countries, we call these things estimates. And they are things that underpin the appropriation law or the budget bill per se. And they give you additional information. So the quality of this additional documentation is really important for parliamentary scrutiny because it gives you the context and the understanding that you require to analyze the figures that the government wants you to authorize. And the quality of this additional supporting documentation varies greatly across countries. And here, I think, are some very important issues. I'm happy to pursue any of them. I'm not going to give you another set of long examples, but if any of these interest you, I'm very happy to talk about them more. So ideally, I think good budget documentation gives you past spending information and forward estimates on a program basis. So programs, for example, only make sense if you can connect them with the past and if you can see an estimate of the consequences, the financial consequences, the financial cost of carrying on this program into the future. So in some very good budget documents, you have 5 years or 6 of financial information at the program level. So not only for the annual budget, but also the audited amounts for past years, two past years, the current year, the proposed year, and possibly 1 or 2, sometimes 3, but I've worked with budgets where there are 2 outer years, so forward-looking estimates of what the program will cost if current law or current policy continues into the future. And that gives you a timeline, which is really powerful because you can ask questions like, why is this line going up? Or, we gave you this amount last year, but you only spent half of it. What happened? What have you done to make sure that you can spend this money better in the coming year? If you just get financial information for 1 year, you can't ask these questions. So this is really crucial. The historical information and the forward estimates, are they in the budget documentation and at what level of detail? Very important. The compatibility with accounting and year-end information. So when we came in 8 years ago with the OECD, this was a big topic here, and it still is, as far as I understand. But it's also, Estonia is not unique in this regard, so this is really a big problem in many countries. In the UK, the Treasury had a project that ran something close to 5 years, I think. It was called Clear Line of Sight, which gives you a little bit of an idea of what it was all about, which was essentially about aligning budgets, estimates on which the appropriations are based, and annual accounts. Because what they realized was that the 3 important sets of documents, budgets, which were more for planning on the executive side, the estimates, which were used to underpin parliamentary authorization, and then the annual accounts after the end of the fiscal year, didn't talk to one another. There were amounts missing, some bits of finances were in one set of documentation, but not in the next set, etc. So the UK has had a big process over the past 5 years to make them comparable. And this is really crucial. So the picture of Gladstone I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, William Gladstone in the UK was the person who not only created the Public Accounts Committee in the House of Commons, one of the most important committees and most powerful committees actually in the House of Commons, but he also was the one who made the Auditor General prepare, or who made sure there were annual accounts prepared that followed the appropriation structure, which would then be audited by the Auditor General. So the whole system of parliamentary control relies on the comparability of annual accounts with approved budgets. And he was, that was his big idea, and that was one of the things that he put in place 150 years ago. So very, very important. How do you make sure that you can actually, when you get accounts, you can compare them to what you authorized prior to the start of the fiscal year? And it's a big problem when in many countries, when there are shifts in the accounting basis to accruals, but the appropriation basis stays on cash, for example, for some time. So these are often issues that cause problems. But it's really very important to get right. Otherwise you can't use the accounts and the audit information to look back on what you approved and compare these figures. And you should be able to compare them. There's a big debate in OECD countries on the next one, the inclusion of non-financial performance information in budget documents. I'm very cautious when it comes to this. I think very often when we move to including a lot of performance information that is not directly relevant to budgeting per se, very often we lose focus, and this has kind of distorts a little bit the budget documentation, puts a lot of information in there that is not directly relevant for financial decision making. So I would be, I think, more on the cautious side. There are people who have other opinions on this, but I would think very carefully what is good non-financial performance information that I want to put in there. For example, if a program is directly driven by certain, if you need, or if a program is driven by the production of certain outputs, you will want a target or a measure that measures the production of these outputs. So the New Zealand approach, for example, how many licenses will you issue every year? These kinds of things are things that they would have in the budget documentation. And these are performance measures. Or how many maritime port patrols will be done every year, or something like that. And that's what you appropriate. You say, I buy 1,000, 2,000 port patrols for security purposes, or I buy the issuing of 1 million licenses, or something like that. So you actually purchase the outputs, so you have the measures of what is produced with the money. In some other cases, the link between the performance information and the actual spending information is much more tenuous. And I would be careful to put too much non-financial performance information into budget documents. And then the last point really is about explaining each program in the budget. So we need some kind of narrative information in the budget that says, what is this program all about? What is it meant to do? And what are we doing? What exactly are we doing in this program? What are the activities that we carry out? So again, not too detailed, but there's a lot of information that we need to make sense of financial figures. So we can talk about any of these in follow-up. Let me make a couple of broad points, and I'm almost done. I have maybe five more minutes. So I've shown you a few examples of countries that focus on inputs, outputs, outcomes, and then some in-between countries. So South Africa was probably in between outputs and outcomes. What does that mean for Parliament? So if you look at the first line really is, if you focus on inputs, you exercise a high level of detailed control. The United States Congress really does want to know how much an individual office bearer in the Department for Transportation spends on his office. And that's what they do. A very high degree of control over the executive. When you start shifting to outputs, you're starting to ask questions about efficiency. To what extent are you producing the maximum amount of goods or services given the resources that you have, given the inputs that you have? When you shift to outcomes, like Australia, you're asking questions about policy. You're asking, this is what I want to achieve. Are the outputs that we are producing the best we can produce in order to impact on these particular outcomes? Are there alternative outputs that we should produce in order to achieve this outcome? So you're asking questions about policy effectiveness. These are all very different approaches to scrutinizing government action. So the focus of scrutiny in Parliament is very, very different. Then what's quite clear in the examples that I showed you, this is directly linked to how much financial information you have in the approved budgets. So the appropriation detail is extremely high if you want tight input control like the United States Congress. You'll end up with a set of appropriation documents that is many hundreds of pages with many, many thousands of line items, thousands. And once you move to an output basis, that becomes less. The New Zealand example was a couple of pages long. Once you move to outcomes, you aggregate up almost completely. So the Australian example was a third of a page. So the appropriation detail, the further you go from input control to outcome control, the less detailed will the appropriations be. As a result, the degree of executive flexibility increases. So the more detail you have in the appropriations, the less discretion the executive has in managing this money. The United States government is incredibly shackled, constrained by the very detailed appropriations that Congress writes. The Australian government is almost completely free in spending this money. So what's important for Parliament is that these approaches require different sets of expertise. I think if you look at an input-based system, the Finance Committee or the Budget Committee is really the hub of financial scrutiny. When you look at countries that have moved to a more output or outcome-based system, you need to bring in more and more the expertise of sector committees. Sector committees, I mean health, education, defense, and so on. So the people who actually work in the policy area. Because you're starting to ask, you're getting closer and closer to questions around policy where you need this expertise. So there's a link here to the committee structure that you use in Parliament to process this information. And the further you go to an outcome, a performance focus based on outcomes, the more you need to involve sector committees because you need that expertise, that sector-specific expertise. You're less likely to have that as finance specialists. You have other strengths as members of finance committees, that you have the financial focus, you have the overall focus on the budget. That's very, very important. But the more you focus to performance and asking questions about policy, the more reliant you become on expertise that resides also in other committees. The next two are very important to me. So one is about the time horizon. When you start holding government to account, or when you hold government to account for inputs or for outputs, the fiscal year is an appropriate time horizon. Money can get spent in a year. Outputs can be produced by government organizations within a 12-month calendar period. And you can hold government organizations to account for how they spend the money and what they produce with it. When it comes to impacts on society, these time horizons don't fit neatly into a 12-year accounting period. And they vary greatly across different policy areas. the kinds of impacts that you might be looking at when you're thinking about defense, long-term strategic issues in defense, for example, or population planning, education outcomes, health outcomes, have very different time horizons, and they don't neatly fit within a 12-month calendar period. So once you start holding government to account, or trying to hold government to account for outcomes, the financial year, a 12-month period, is no longer a very useful reference category. And that's very important, I think. Because to me, it suggests that holding to account for outcomes is not the appropriate thing to do for an annual budget process. That links a little bit to the last point I'm trying to make here. So attribution means the extent to which you can hold individuals or individual government organizations to account for what they do with the money and the goods and services that they produce. You can do that once you focus on inputs or outputs. You can no longer do that when you focus on outcomes. Why is that the case? A, because most outcomes require that different government organizations work together, and because of the point that I made earlier, outcomes take a longer time period to materialize. So one of my objectives is to increase birth rates, for example. This is probably something I might do over a 5 or 10 year period. It's very hard to think of this as something that I can sit down and achieve within the 12-month period, and in a very hard way. Similarly, it's most likely something that will involve a number of different government organizations working together. In the UK, we had one of my favorite examples relates to climate change targets, which were set for the year 2050. So that gives you an idea of the kind of long-range outcome objectives. So this was about reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. Once you take a view of 50 years, you have 5, 6 government ministries that have to cooperate in order to work on climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Ministers change every 2 years, if you're lucky. So over a 50-year period, you've got 5 government organizations, on average 25 ministers for each of these 5. By 2050, who are you going to hold to account? And in the interim, who are you going to hold to account? So outcomes make it very difficult to hold any one government organization to account. And the last point, obviously, being that there are external factors that affect whether you're achieving an outcome or not. Climate change, technological changes, changes in preferences of consumers, things that have nothing to do with the behavior and the services and goods that governments produce. So it's very difficult to hold anyone really to account. Even if you achieve an outcome, it's unclear what the link is to what government did, at least through the budget process. So I very much caution to focus too much on outcomes as part of the annual budget process. I think outcomes are crucial, but the annual budget process is the wrong vehicle for thinking about outcomes. There are other ways of doing this, a good evaluation mechanism, policy evaluation mechanisms, in government program evaluations and so on, but this is not part of the annual budget process. Good performance audits that focus on the achievement of outcomes. These are great tools, but they're not part of annual decision-making over the use of public money. I think this really is my last slide. I was asked to say a little bit about how the annual budget fits with multi-annual strategies, which is a big issue in Estonia. So pre-budget statements and medium-term strategies offer opportunities for parliamentary debate ahead of the annual budget. I give you 2 examples of how this is done in other countries. In the UK, there's a spring budget statement and an autumn statement. And the autumn statement is a little bit like a pre-budget statement. So it gives you kind of a more strategic view on public spending ahead of the tabling of the estimates early in the year. And the UK government also uses the autumn statement to every few years table a so-called spending review, which is a multi-year settlement of public spending for departments. So this is only at the moment, it's done at the beginning of the parliamentary term. You get a spending review that is tabled. So it's for a 5-year period, and it locks in certain types of spending across government departments for the life of the parliament. Different approach in Sweden, but also an interesting one from a parliamentary perspective. So Sweden introduced a 2-step budget process in parliament in the 1990s, where they tabled a spring fiscal policy bill in April, followed by the budget in the autumn. What's interesting is, and we talked a little bit about this before, so the Swedes have almost taken a step back from that approach, because they found, so initially the spring fiscal policy bill set ceilings for a 3-year period, a total expenditure ceiling, and it set indicative allocations for 27 expenditure areas, like health, education, defense, and so on. And what the Swedish parliamentarians said, when they started doing that, it felt like they were doing budgets twice a year, in the spring and in the autumn. And they took a step back, and they still have a spring fiscal policy bill, but they no longer fix the ceiling and the allocations until the budget bill in the autumn. So an interesting 2-step setup here. On an annual basis, they vote both of these bills, or they vote both the annual budget as well as the spring fiscal policy bill, but also a bit of a shift in terms of what exactly they do when they have the spring fiscal policy bill. And that's where I wanted to leave it. It's important to remember there's no perfect system. So budget reform is always more of a journey than a destination. It will never be perfect. I think focusing on performance is really appealing. It's also in many ways the right thing to do. I think it's desirable that we shift away from detailed input control to asking questions about outputs and outcomes. But it means that Parliament has to let go to some degree of controlling at a very detailed level inputs for governments. I think a focus on outputs is compatible with the annual cycle of budgeting. So if you're thinking about reformatting, redesigning the annual budget law, for example, I would make a case that thinking about outputs is quite compatible with annual budgeting and the annual approval of public money, but not a focus on outcomes. So outcomes are something that it's very important to think about outcomes, but a tight link between annual budgeting and outcomes is very hard to achieve. The two don't go naturally together. And then the area I would think very hard about is what exactly is it that's desirable to have in the supporting documentation that goes with the annual budget law. So rethinking the memorandum, what kind of information should be in there that makes it useful for you as parliamentarians to understand the budget requests of the government that you asked to authorize, and making sure you have program-based information that's both historical and forward-looking, for example, is very important in my view. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Aitäh meie külalisele ettekande eest ja nüüd on siis võimalus küsimusi esitada.
Urve Tiidus is my name, and I was wondering, very good information about budgeting in different countries, but I was wondering, have you ever had a chance to have a look at the EU budgeting process? Would you like to comment very briefly on it? And you said there is no ideal budgeting form in the world, but is there any country you would still suggest as an example to follow? Thank you.
Shall I respond now? Yeah. I'm not an EU budgeting expert. It's funny, I was with the European Court of Auditors 2 weeks ago because the Commission apparently is putting more emphasis on performance when it comes to funding with that is given to member states. But I'm not an EU budgeting person. I've worked in quite a few EU member countries on national budget processes. And I'm aware that the interaction between EU funds and national budgets is a big issue. So I'm not necessarily the best person to help you with that. The one thing it's really hard to say there's one country that's the best. It depends a little bit, and personally I can't say there's like one country that's the ideal country to look at. I think if you're looking at redesigning estimates, some countries have very good budget documentation. I think New Zealand is a great example. South Africa is a very, very good example of program-based estimates that are very, very informative and give you a lot of information. Beyond that, the kind of process of voting the budget and so on differs hugely across countries. I think Sweden is an interesting one also because they did such extensive reforms during the 1990s, and that was driven very much by concern about Parliament and the role of Parliament in the process. So they have an interesting perspective also on to what extent has this worked. How do you bring Parliament into more strategic debates around fiscal policy via the Spring Fiscal Policy Bill? They also have done, they set up kind of a fiscal council a bit before it became a requirement with the fiscal treaty and so on. So there are interesting elements in the Swedish system and the Swedish experience that might be worth looking at. But I'm cautious to say here's like the one ideal country to look at. But I think budget documentation, New Zealand, South Africa, very, very good, very informative budget documentation. And in terms of the process of the parliamentary process, I think the Swedish experience since the 1990s is very interesting. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Urmet Lee. I'm from National Audit Office of Estonia. Been dealing with those understandability and transparency issues for some time. Do I read you correctly that this understandability is really defined by the parliamentarians themselves? You explained some principles that, yeah, if you focus on inputs, if you focus on outcomes or outputs, that defines certain things. But at the end of the day, what is considered to be good or bad explanation, that is impossible to define universally. And that must be said by somebody. Is it, I don't know, the audit office or the parliament? I would argue in Estonian case that in many times this is Ministry of Finance. They define how they present information, which is sort of more convenient way for them. And then the rest of us struggle to read through that material, which is, if you have all the detailed information correct, you hardly can argue that they present misleading information. Sometimes they forgot something. Yes, that's true, because there's a lot of information simply. But yeah, long story short, how much do you think the parliamentarians themselves should be on driver's position in defining how things are presented?
I think you've put your finger on a really important point. I mean, partly the budget structure, the appropriation structures I showed you reflect very different powers of national legislatures. the United States Congress writes these appropriation bills. They write these lines. They write it. You know, there's no finance OMB, the Office for Management and Budget, doesn't write these bills. So it's Congress that congressmen, congresswomen who write these lines. If I look at the UK, these are appropriations written by the Treasury, and you can see that these are, they do exactly what the Treasury wants them to do. Yeah? And over the years, there has been a shift. So appropriations used to come out of Parliament, but in most cases they're now written and drafted by finance ministries. So yes, to some extent it's a political question in the sense of, you know, how useful do you want them to be, and useful for whom? Useful for the finance ministry or useful for Parliament? And that's a hard, you know, it's very hard to say, you know, where are you in this? The fact that this is a discussion here, I think, is important, and it's a parliamentary initiative. There have been examples of parliaments that have pushed in this regard. So the French reform of the organic public finance law, the Loi Organique, LOLF for short, came out of a parliamentary initiative, and they redesigned the format of the budget, amongst many other things. Also in the South African case, the South Africans used to vote the budget, like in the UK, essentially by department. And they did a reform in 1999-2000, where they moved to voting it on a program basis. So they essentially enhanced parliamentary control by making the programs binding. And by making programs binding, departments also take them seriously. Previously, you can have programs, they change every year, very, you know, they're produced, they're put in the documentation, but no one takes them very seriously. But once money is tied to them in a very specific sense, people take them more seriously, and over time you get better programs. So sometimes, in the UK has just launched an inquiry into the estimates process, which includes looking at the budget documentation that's given to Parliament. So there are examples of parliaments claiming back this territory, and I'm a big supporter of this. I mean, I think this is your means of control as Parliament, and you should have a big say in the format of these documentations. I think it's important that it's congruent with what the finance ministry does. I think you need to understand the system. But, you know, it's a parliamentary means of control. And we said often in this report, 2 or 3 mentions here in our report 8 years ago that say it's very important to talk to the Parliament about the program structure. Very important to talk to the Parliament about the program structure. We said this eight years ago. This is a very important conversation, I think.
A follow-up question. Have you observed any sort of correlation between the electoral systems and how budgets are prepared and presented, meaning majority-based, or we have the coalition governments with rather not so strong financial minister? I mean, these are also, in my view, some relevant things, how budget looks like. What's your comment?
I would make one observation. It's possibly less a link between the electoral system and the role of the Parliament, but it's certainly, if I look at the countries that have gone furthest down the route of performance, there's a reason why I showed you Australia and New Zealand and so on. They are Westminster-style countries, and these are very weak legislatures, by and large. So it's, I think you can have coalition government with strong legislative oversight. The Germans, for example, in the German case, the budget committee is a very meaningful actor in the budget process, and This is funny because the finance ministry had a reform proposal. Now I think it's almost 10 years ago, a bit less than 10 years ago, to introduce program budgeting. And the budget committee said, no, we want to keep our lines. We don't want your programs. Which I think in the long run, I can understand, but they wanted to retain that control. They wanted to keep looking at very low level of disaggregation in the budget committee. But in the long run, I think a move towards good programs with maybe a lot of additional financial information is something that's a good development. But it's hard to how to reconcile the two, keeping control in Parliament and having a budget that is performance-oriented and that goes away from just strictly controlling inputs. So I didn't properly answer your question, but I think these are important. Political context is very important, but I'm not sure it's necessarily electoral system or coalition government per se, but there are other elements in the political system that make parliaments weak politically or strong. And it's true that sometimes the countries that have gone furthest down this performance orientation are very often countries with weak legislatures, because the philosophy of letting managers manage to some degree is based on executive discretion. You need to give freedom to managers, and that some parliaments are not willing to grant. The US Congress will never give that to presidential administrations. So.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Enneken Lip from Ministry of Finance, Budget Department. I have a question for Mr. Kõljarg. Should I go on in Estonian or English? Oh, all right. Te räägite ennist sellest raportist, et kas te võite nagu avaldada, et seda sisu selles mõttes, et kas see oli seotud üldse sellega, et tulemusinfot eelarves võiks rohkem kajastada, või olete ka seda meelt, et line itemsid on vajalikud teie vaates?
Et ma selles mõttes ei taha seda raporti, just neid intervjuusid veel väga kommenteerida, kuna tegelikult Rahandusministeeriumiga on plaanis ja tegelikult meil on osad ka Riigikogu liikmed veel intervjueerimata. Aga suures pildis, kus see alguse sai, oligi ju see teema, et see nii-öelda mõistmine, eelarve mõistmine, Riigikogu liikmete poolt on raskendatud ja tegelikult kuhu mina jõudsin, oligi ka see, et tegelikult nii nagu Joachim siin välja tõi, et tegelikult neid valikuid on erinevaid ja lõpuks selle et me peame valima, et kas me tahame siis väga täpset eelarvet või me pigem tahame, sedasama programmipõhist, nagu Haridus-Teadusministeeriumil, see aasta juba on, et muidugi seal peab vaatama, et kas, kui täpseks see peaks minema ja nii edasi. Aga et tegelikult, ma arvan, et me peame selle raporti kontekstis tõsiselt tööd tegema selles osas, et mis tegelikult see suund võiks olla, et tegelikult see ei ole päris nii mustvalge, et nagu võib-olla esialgu tundub, eks. I will make the conclusion in English because I don't know if you have translation. I think it's quite similar to the answer I gave, just because when we are conducting the interviews with the members of parliament, it seems that their wishes are also contradictory, and that's why we actually asked Joachim to come here and also speak about those different ways of doing a budget, and I think really hard work is ahead of us, because when we make those propositions to the parliament, how to maybe make changes in the system, I think they should be based on some experience from other parliaments, and also our own past experience, and I hope that the report at least gives some suggestions how to make the members of the parliament more engaged in the budget process, and more happy with the form of the budget and the memorandum with it, and finally, I think it's more or less a cooperation between the ministries, Minister of Finance with the Audit Office, and us in the Parliament. So I thank you all that you made it here, and thank you, Joachim, that you made it here, and I was happy to see that some other members were also here, although we had a really difficult heading for the event. So thanks, all of you.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone is still translating, but thank you again for inviting me back. I spoke to Mr. Tender from the Finance Ministry a couple of weeks ago, so we had an exchange over this. Just to say, if there are any questions from any of you, really, but especially, of course, with Parliament, or if you would like to get any access to material and you think I can help with anything, I'd be delighted to do that. I think it's a very, very important question. I think also that it can be mutually beneficial for the Finance Ministry and government and the Parliament to come up with a good solution, right? It's not something necessarily that I would want to frame too much as a tension between Parliament and government, but it's in everyone's interest to have a budget process that is well designed and that makes sense. And I think when you have decision-making that's not lined up and a bit disjointed, which is still a little bit what is the case with the state budget strategy process and then the annual budget law and how they fit together, if you have a situation like that, it's nowhere ideal. It occurs in many places, but it's nowhere ideal, and I think finding a good way of making this process better connected is important and of interest to many actors, state audit as well. So I look forward to also staying in touch. That's what I maybe would say. Thank you very much for having me.
Ja minagi siis lõpetuseks, et tegelikult kõik see pikk jutt eelarve läbipaistvusest või mitte läbipaistvusest, see algas eelmises Riigikogu koosseisus, kui tulid vanad tegijad need, kes olid 90-ndatel Riigikogus ja äkki avastasid, et riigieelarve on niivõrd muutunud, et see vahe on lihtsalt drastiline. Nad mäletasid seda, kuidas omal ajal esimest korda Riigikogusse tulles nad võtsid kätte need kollased raamatud ja kõik oli ilmselge, absoluutselt läbipaistev, kõik oli absoluutselt arusaadav. Ei olnud vaja olla ei majandusinimene, ökonomist, keegi teine, võtsid, lugesid, said kõigest aru. Ja nad võrdlesid sellega, mis oli juba 12. koosseisus, eks ju, kus selleks, et mingit infot saada, oli vaja tuhnida, otsida, küsida ja see vahe tundus väga drastiline. Pärast valas bensiini juurde veel riigi kontroll, kes tegi meile 1938. vist, mälu järgi, aasta Eesti Vabariigi eelarve ja seda lugedes üldse tuleb pisar silma. Nii et me liigume kuidagi imelikult absoluutselt läbipaistmatu eelarve poole. Ma saan aru, et siin suurt midagi muuta vist ei õnnestu, kui tendents on selline, siis ta jätkub, siin ei muuta midagi. Aga me midagi ikka üritame teha. Ja ma tänan kõiki, kes täna võtsid sellest kohtumisest osa ja meie külalist eraldi ja Kristjanit selle tööst, mida ta praegu teeb ja aitäh teile ja nägemist!